We're going to get started in just a minute. We're going to give our city attorney a minute. Also, just going to make sure these all go down here. So, Jesse, let me grab you for 1 second, or so we're probably going to. Okay, bear with us for 1 second here. Okay, good afternoon. We're going to begin with a briefing on the events of last night in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And let me start with a couple of items and let folks know that we're going to hear from some gentlemen from our police department. We're also going to hear from our city attorney on some legal issues around this matter. And we're also going to hear from our cultural services director with respect to this Oñate sculpture. And then we'll try and take as many questions as we can. Now, for weeks, our community has been peacefully protesting against racism that has been ingrained so deeply in our system and in the system around the country. And whether it's from policing to statues, these issues have brought up so much pain and anger all across our country. Now, the shooting last night in Old Town at the Oñate sculpture was horrific and unacceptable act of violence. This is something that, despite all of that dialogue, should never happen. Now, for us, despite the peaceful and meaningful vigil that occurred before, a smaller group remained with very different intentions. This kind of violence has no place in Albuquerque. Our hearts go out to the victim and his family, who I checked in with earlier today. He's very much in our prayers and in a very still difficult situation right now with respect to his life. Last night, the sculpture became more than a symbol. It became a matter of public safety, and it is being removed today. Now, I want to take a step back and talk about what appears to have happened before the shooting took place. It appears that the perpetrator was agitating at the protest well before the shooting took place. Multiple witnesses and some videos and reports have shown that he violently was throwing a woman to the ground before the fighting broke out. I understand there are many concerns about the first police report that was filed and that it did not include this information. And I want you to know that that's just a preliminary report, and the supplemental information, including the instigation of this incident by the perpetrator, will absolutely be filed and recorded with the DA's office. Now, we are also working now with state police. We're handing this investigation over to them in cooperation with the DA's office to make sure that this is an independent investigation. We are also asking our police oversight board to review the tactics that were used that night. I want to remind everyone that our department is under the DOJ consent decree, known as the CASA. This means also that a judge and the different filers to that settlement agreement also have a say and input in this process, which, albeit sometimes time-consuming, is public. It is also transparent, and I believe it will bring accountability to those who, in the end, after investigations, if they're determined that there needs to be folks held accountable. Now, starting last night, APD began providing more info to the DA's office and, again, is compiling a full accounting of what happened and is continuing to do interviews. Our commander is going to speak to why some of those interviews were interrupted because of what was happening on the street. So I want to be clear that this investigation will continue. It will be independent, and all these facts will be brought to light. We also want to reiterate that we have the suspect in custody, and we will continue to give the DA and the state police all the information as we get it, and we're going to continue to seek the strongest possible prosecution and justice in this matter. Now, across the nation, we know that there have been outside groups interfering with peaceful protests, and sadly, we are not exempt from this right here in Albuquerque. There are many names for these groups, different groups, vigilantes, different armed civilian groups, NM Civil Guard. These groups are often at protests, and they have been for quite some time, attempting to prop up white supremacy, trying to intimidate those speaking out, and they are armed with weapons. We want to reiterate that weapons have no place in public actions and protests. And after the shooting, there were indeed dozens of guns and numerous knives on the street at this event, which made decision-making for our officers extremely difficult, with dozens of loaded firearms on the street. Now, because of our state constitution, the city is limited to what we can do for guns. I want to remind folks that New Mexico is one of many western states where cities are not allowed to regulate weapons, and that includes weapons at protests. This is something that, as many of you know, we've tried to do what we can do. We tried to ban guns at community centers where our children play and learn, and we've been tied up in federal court ever since that ban actually took place. So we do know there's an opportunity here for our state legislature to take this up in the next session and try and change that constitutional amendment. We also are working with federal authorities to hold these groups accountable to the fullest extent of the law. That includes federal hate group designation and prosecution. We are working with federal agencies, including the FBI, that are now actively engaged on this issue that I remain very concerned about and may be related to domestic terrorism in our city. Now, we have a diverse community here in Albuquerque, and we know that we have been through a lot. Our history, despite being almost 400 years old, in many ways is raw. There are fresh scars still from things like colonization. But I know our community cannot be divided by this, and we can also not be silenced by these groups that are trying to interfere. So I want to be clear about one thing. APD officers are prohibited from coordinating or cooperating with any members of outside groups attempting to interfere with protests or law enforcement. That has been the case, and any officer who breaks that policy will come under investigation under multiple independent oversight bodies to determine a range of disciplinary actions that can occur, all based on that consent agreement and under the authority of the judge. Now, our department does what we can to try and best solve for the safety of everyone in our city. And the challenge is many of these events, many protests evolve. And we're going to talk about what happened last night. So to begin with some of the details around this, our city attorney, Esteban Aguilar.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon. Last night, police responded quickly, using emergency response measures to clear the crowds, to protect protesters, and to detain suspects. We will fully cooperate with and work with all investigators and the prosecutors to hold the perpetrator accountable. Officers have been collecting evidence from the crime scene since last night. Last night, in the interests of keeping people safe, we asked witnesses to leave the area. However, we did receive many videos and witness statements, and will continue to collect that information and provide them to the appropriate authorities. Anyone having any information regarding the events of last night or anything relevant to the incident should contact 242 Cops. The city, we have heard the calls and questions about why we did not intervene sooner to stop armed extremists from showing up to protests. Our instincts are the same, and our tendency is toward taking the same kind of preventative steps that we know work and could have stopped armed individuals from escalating an otherwise peaceful protest. Unfortunately, the current legal reality is that any effort to step in before a crime is committed is frustrated by both First and Second Amendment rights of individuals who have the right, as the courts have interpreted, to attend those protests without interference. As a city, we are specifically, within the state of New Mexico, prohibited by the New Mexico Constitution from regulating anything incident to the right to bearing arms, and are limited to enforcing existing state law. Where possible, as the mayor alluded to earlier, we have taken steps to remind folks about those regulations and prohibiting people from bringing weapons, dangerous weapons, into our community centers, as an example. However, most of the last year, we have been tied up fighting legal battles over that exact issue, which is basically challenging common sense enforcement of our ability to keep people safe within those facilities. I do want to assure everyone, though, that within minutes last night of the situation turning dangerous, the officers that the department had staged nearby responded and immediately detained the shooter and all of the other armed individuals who were on site. We need action from the state legislature, up to and including state constitutional amendments if necessary, to give local communities, including Albuquerque, the power to proactively stop this kind of escalation, intimidation, and violence, which will allow our city to do and to take common sense measures for our community. Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you so much to our city attorney for that. Now I want to hand it over to our Chief of Police, Chief Mike Iyer.
It is unfortunate and upsetting that once again I have to stand here and denounce vigilante actions and any attempts by citizens to intervene in protest. Protests have been peaceful over the past few weeks. We have done everything possible to keep them peaceful and protect the protesters. But the continued involvement of agitators, whether it is a single individual or a group of vigilantes, is resulting in this violence. A young man was seriously injured last night. So let me make it clear again. APD opposes vigilante actions. We also discourage the presence of armed citizens at protests, which has the potential to escalate violence, not prevent it. We saw this last night. The department does not work with these groups. We will not allow it to happen. Our challenge as a department is to strike the right balance during protest. APD was criticized in years past for being too heavy-handed and escalating them. We know that when police show up, that alone can escalate tensions. So now there is almost no agreement in the community about the level of appropriate visible police presence during these protests. As these disagreements and debates unfold, we must continue using the safety of our community as our guiding principle. The challenge with these situations is we have to monitor them closely and make the appropriate response. The most reasonable response being is to protect human life. While some people thought officers were protecting the armed individuals after the shooting last night, the truth is we had to detain and disarm them to ensure that the scene was safe. Our officers gathered more than 20 guns from just 4 individuals. I want to emphasize that the investigation into the actual shooting, to emphasize this, is that it's ongoing and moving forward. The initial criminal complaint was filed overnight, was just that, an initial preliminary complaint. Detectives have been working and continue to work with federal officials, the district attorney's office, and now the state police to make sure that the entire sequence of events that led up to the shooting is investigated. There is a lot of video and many witnesses yet to be interviewed. The DA's office will be the ones to determine any additional charges. So with that, thank you.
Okay, and to walk through some of the details actually on the event, Commander Art Sanchez. Commander.
Thank you. I appreciate you all being here. I know how important this is to everybody, and especially to our community. So I'm going to run you a little bit through some of the things that we did and how we responded to this incident. Last night's events were planned, and they were peaceful events. We approached these events as we normally do any other event like this. When we first received information that there may be some individuals with firearms at the location, we decided that we needed to have a quick response team. And the reason for having that quick response team, again, is to ensure the safety of everybody that was present at that assembly. Along with the response team was our emergency response team, along with our quick response team. They were staged nearby in order to respond, however, out of sight so that we would allow anybody attending this event to attend it peacefully. When we started seeing some of the individuals have altercations, in particular some of the pepper spray that was being dispersed. Our ERT team deployed from a pre-staged location to the location of where the group was. Within about a minute, there was a report of shots fired, and at that point we deployed our quick response team. The quick response team was there to ensure the safety of not only, because we had already been notified about a victim, and the safety of the victim, and to also take the individuals responsible into custody. When the quick response team arrived there, probably within 2 minutes from the time that the call of shots fired came out. With our response team was an EMT. As we do with any of our quick response teams, we always have a paramedic. So it was important that when we arrived that we secured that scene and provide medical attention to the victim while ensuring that we took the individuals into custody that were involved in the shooting. We did have to use some crowd control techniques, and the reason for using those was, as I stated earlier, it was important for us to secure that scene, and so we did have to move some of the individuals back to provide that distance for the first aid. One of the things that we really had to contend with was the fact that we had over a dozen guns on scene that had been removed, along with about 34 magazines that had been removed from some of the individuals. So that was another issue that we had to address. Once we detained the individuals, we were able to remove them from the scene. The victim was transported, obviously, by rescue within a few minutes. There was not only medical attention provided by an officer, but there was medical attention that was also provided by a citizen that was there. And as the chief said, every time that we respond to something like this, we do our best to learn from those situations and improve upon those situations.
Okay, now we know a lot of this also has to do with a statue of Oñate, and so our Cultural Services Department had been working on setting up some discussions, some truth and reconciliation with respect to this in our history. To speak more on this issue, the Director of Cultural Services, Shel Sanchez.
It is heartbreaking that the peaceful prayer vigil that I attended last night in Tigway Park was overshadowed by senseless violence later in the evening. It's a sad day knowing that a community member was needlessly injured near the grounds of the Albuquerque Museum. This is a cultural gathering place meant to bring us together as a community. On Saturday, we had issued a public invitation to gain input and to thoughtfully bring together various perspectives for a path forward regarding the statue of Oñate. We still invite and we still need our community to come together with the intention of openness and willingness to engage in productive and peaceful dialogue. We want to support, as a city, we want to support our community in this critical discussion, and we want participation from all perspectives. After our call on Saturday for participation, we have already received dozens of calls and emails from community members who want to be engaged in this dialogue. For those who are interested in this invitation, send your contact information to cultureabq@cabq.gov. Yesterday afternoon, artist Reynaldo Sunny Rivera reached out to our department and requested that the sculpture of Oñate that he was commissioned to create be temporarily removed from the installation outside the Albuquerque Museum. This was out of his personal concern for community safety, as well as the safekeeping of this sculpture. Mr. Rivera voluntarily signed a waiver to allow this piece to be altered, in this case removed, without the standard 90 days notice afforded to him under the Federal Visual Artists' Rights Act. Today, this afternoon, we removed the Oñate statue and placed it in temporary storage in order to preserve public safety, but also in accordance with the wishes of the artist. People are extremely passionate about this statue, about Oñate, not only today, but for many, many years in our history. Albuquerque, we are better than the violence that we saw last night. Please join us for public dialogue centered on community, reconciling of our history, and healing for our city. Thank you.
Okay, I think what we'll do next is try and take as many questions as we can. And as a reminder to folks, as usual, especially during the time of Corona, I'll take the question, try and repeat the question, and we'll have the appropriate person respond. And to coordinate, especially because of the online aspect of this, I think Jesse's going to do that for us.
Yeah, we'll start with the online questions, and then we'll move to in-person questions because we have many people here. We have one here from Chris Keller at Albuquerque Business First. What are the plans to preemptively address other facilities that bear Oñate's name or likeness?
The question is from unrelated to Chris Keller at the Albuquerque Business Journal, and the question is about what about these other Oñate-related things in our city. And let me just say that our Cultural Services Director can speak to this, but I also want to mention a lot of them are not city properties, so there's a wide range of Oñate-related things. And so, Shel, if you want to come speak to that in general.
So there are several things, and as the mayor said, not all of them actually reside within the city. I think the most important thing about the process and the people that we're bringing in to lead, these are people who have done this kind of work in other communities and in our own community. And this dialogue about Oñate is not only a dialogue about this sculpture. And so I think the right community process and the right level of community engagement and people really coming together to talk about what is best for community and what is healing and how do we move forward. This kind of process can really help us move through solving all of these issues that are related but are not necessarily a singular statue.
Next.
Okay, thank you. One here from Patrick Hayes at KOB. Have police found any connection between the New Mexico Civil Guard and Stephen Baca?
Questions about connection between one of these groups and the perpetrator, Stephen Baca. And that one probably is under investigation, but I'm going to ask our team here if there's any update on that. So I'll check with either Commander or Steve. Commander?
This incident's still under investigation, so I can't provide you the answer yet, as it is in the early stages of the investigation.
Of course, that'll now after the transition in the next day or two, state police would be the ones to also answer that question.
Okay, thank you. A question here from Nate O'Neill at KOB. You spoke about reports of vigilante groups possibly instigating violence. Do you think federal hate group designation is appropriate, and what would that entail?
So the question is about this challenge around federal hate groups designation, what that entails. It is a federal process, and so what we've done is we've asked the federal government to look into this. I know some other public leaders from Albuquerque have also done this. And with respect to what that all entails, that's really an appropriate question for the federal government.
Thank you, Mayor. A question here from Chris McKee at KRQE News. Has APD determined if Baca obtained his gun legally or if he had a concealed carry permit?
Another question about the firearm carried by Mr. Baca. And this one, again, I'll check with EPD for what they can share at this time, and going forward, that one will probably be the state police.
I'll take that, Chief.
Oh, actually, Chief will take that one.
So when a gun is recovered, we work closely with the ATF. They're instituting an investigation right now. They have the ability to nationwide do a national check on whether they actually trace that gun to its original origin, and so that process is in effect right now.
Okay, I think we'll switch to in-person questions right now and then come back to Zoom.
This question is for APD. Can we talk about what protest protocol looks like? Yesterday we did not see the helicopter and we did not see any roadblocks. Can we just talk about if there's a protest happening tonight at 6 p.m., what are the decisions being made and what teams are being activated?
So the question is, how do we handle protest protocol and so forth when it's being activated? I think our chief can field that. I know they have to try and match the response with what we think the event's going to be, and that also evolves.
And I may defer a little bit to the commander, but anytime there's a protest planned, we get advance notice if we can through social media or other types of communications. And we do a background investigation as far as the check to see what the intent of that group is. Have we dealt with them before? The location they want to do it, the time of day. We do a complete, predetermination of what we're going to be looking at. Then the ERT teams and the intelligence teams, the detectives, every unit going to be part of that, have a briefing where there's a discussion that takes place, determine the roles and the layout of what we're going to do. Some things are in uniform for all. Our rules of engagements are pretty steady. Some of our tactics and training kind of give that consistency, but again, dynamic situations change. So sometimes we have to bring traffic units in to escort marchers, and other times it's a fixed location, and we have different strategies. Some visible, some, where people are more in the stealth or out of sight. And as far as the specific tactics, I'll defer to the commander because he's more of a part of that aspect. But in general, yeah, we put a lot of preparation hours before an event if we can get that information and make sure that we know pretty much as best we can what we're dealing with. And do you want to add a little bit?
That's a very good question. Yesterday, for yesterday's event, and I know that you had mentioned about how normally you'll see officers, traffic officers. We did actually have traffic units out there. This was a little bit different in the sense that it was not mobile, so you would not see a lot of the traffic officers blocking off some of the streets to if the group was moving. However, we did have traffic units that were staged away in order to respond, and they in fact actually responded pretty quickly to secure some of those streets.
Next question. Yes.
Going to the crowd control tactics that were used, so we have a live feed of what happened, and around 3 minutes in is when you see officers arrive. It's around 24 minutes and 45 seconds. There's a 21-minute window where officers, we see them giving medical aid and closing off, but what was the decision to then fire, and that's what I want to ask, was it smoke bombs, tear gas? We also hear some sort of shots. Was that rubber bullets? So I guess the first question is just what led to that decision 20 minutes in, and also what exactly was being fired? We spoke to a man who do have some wounds on his leg from those pellets.
Mm-hmm. So just to paraphrase the questions around what was used by the department to secure the scene, and I would just mention they were trying to deal with arresting the perpetrator. There were dozens of loaded weapons on the street, and they were trying to administer first aid at the same time. So it got very challenging for our officers. Commander, you should probably feel the rest.
Thank you, sir. So we based the decision on several things. The one, which was one of the most important ones, it was critical that we provide medical attention for the victim. The other was that we needed to make those arrests from the individuals that were responsible. So once our officers deployed, we did have a situation to where we did have some of the group that wanted to move to where the individuals that were being arrested were. So it was important for us to create that space between where our officers were, where the group was, and also where the victim was, and the individuals that we ended up arresting with all those firearms. That really what went into our decision to deploy those. And to answer the other part of your question, we did deploy gas or smoke, and we did deploy OC in the crowd. So.
I'd like to go back to protocol for these protests. You know, we saw cars moving in and out of the area constantly throughout the night until the roads were blocked off after the shooting had happened. We were seeing chains being put around the statue at that point. We had seen multiple people shoving each other. 15 minutes before the shooting, if not even more, we saw a lot of back and forth chatter. Why did APD not step in sooner?
So a couple of questions embedded in there about our response, and we can have our commander speak to some of those. I do just want to mention that, you know, the indication from the department was this was a peaceful vigil, and that's how it started, and that's how it was for a while, and then things rapidly changed, and the department had to adapt, and that's when it got really challenging.
Yes, as the mayor stated, it was, by all accounts, initially a peaceful gathering. Once we received the information of initially the two individuals that had arrived with firearms, that is when we implemented the plan of having those quick response teams. I will say that normally in almost every one of these events, we always do ensure that we have some type of response, whether it's our ERT teams, depending on the size of the group, or even our patrol officers. However, we do our best to try to keep our officers away in an area where they can respond quickly, but where they will be out of sight in order not to interfere with the event that's going on.
I guess I'm confused about the timeline because there were acts of what people would call violence when people are shoving each other and there's a chain being put around the statue, and then 10 to 15 minutes at this point there were a gunshot fired.
Yeah, so the question is that time frame between the different type of responses and what happened. And this is always a challenge in any protest, and so we should probably bring the commander up to speak to that specifically in detail. But I know as part of the review process, that timeline will be mapped out. And this is the one thing in our department, all of this is scrutinized by our Public Oversight Board and through the DOJ process, and now this investigation, of course, will flow through the state police. So those respective timings and where officers were and so forth, that's all under review.
Thank you, Mayor. As the mayor stated, we do review every single one of these responses. We do a thorough review. When we look at an event like this, we evaluate our response to ensure that if we send officers, in this instance, to answer your question when you had asked about sending an officer when they were pulling on the statue, we have to evaluate that and determine if us introducing an officer at that point in time, is it going to possibly escalate it? And our goal is not to escalate any kind of event like this. Our goal is to ensure that it is safe for everyone. So we then look at everything else that is going on with the event. We take into consideration maybe other things that are happening before we determine whether we're going to send a response to the officers. In that situation, we'll say once that spray, the OC spray or pepper spray was used, we deployed the ERT teams that were staged. Now it took only a few minutes for them to get there once they were deployed. And within about 2 minutes of the first shot being fired, our quick response team with the EMT was on scene. So that's kind of the times.
We have a lot of questions here on Zoom, so let's switch back to this and then we'll go back to them. Chris McKee with KRQE News said, witness video shows Baca was in a fight shortly before the shots were fired. Do we know if the people who were fighting with Baca had weapons to include knives?
Question is about the instigation by the perpetrator before the actual shooting took place, which I mentioned all our information is going to be included in that supplemental report. That specific question about whether the other folks were armed or not, that one probably is, I don't know if Commander, that might be one for the DA's office.
It's still, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
As I stated earlier, even though the investigation started last night, soon after this incident happened, the investigation is still moving forward. I know detectives are still trying to identify more witnesses, interview more witnesses, and review videos. So I can't say for sure exactly who else had weapons and what kind of weapons they had until the investigation is really complete.
Thank you. Question here from Patrick Hayes at KOB. According to the police report, Baca opened fire after the victim swung a skateboard at Baca's head and body. Why is this not self-defense?
Questions about some of the details with respect to the altercation. And I think fundamentally that is going to be a question for the courts. And so I don't think anyone has the legal answer other than folks involved with the legal community on that. But anything else with respect to Chief or Commander on that one?
The
Okay.
district attorney will make that determination during the investigation before he.
Good point. Go ahead, Chief. Yeah.
So self-defense is often the case, and when there's two people fighting, even in domestic violence, the primary aggressor is usually a determination that's made, but those are legal, based on legal standards, and really is outside of us. We just collect the reports and the objective information that they make that determination on. Does that answer? Okay.
Okay, question here from Chris McKee at KRQE News. According to Baca's criminal complaint, some APD undercover officers were on scene before the shooting. What were those undercover officers doing?
Questions about other officers on the scene and so forth, and this is part of our general protest protocol, and so want to ask either our Commander or Chief probably to speak to that. Chief?
Again, it's obviously different for each event. Some are peaceful, they're just going to be observers and just make sure. Sometimes they'll listen for the chatter, or as somebody mentioned, is when this first starts getting inciting is hopefully by having some boots on the ground right there that can let other people know and get that information quickly. In this case, we had a few that were doing that, just kind of monitoring it, and they were in the area close to, the situation, but again, they got that pretty quickly to the command post and get that information so that the command, or the ERTs and the emergency teams could respond.
Question here from Maida Aguilar with Univision. In the video, we see how a woman was thrown to the floor by Baca, which, according to protesters, that is when things escalated. Can she press charges for that, and if so, what would he be charged with?
Questions about the woman on the videos who seemed to be attacked by the perpetrator, and this is a good example. We've seen these reports. This is the kind of information that I think you will find in the supplemental report and possibly when the charges come out from the DA's office. So that's really a question for the DA's office, but hypothetically, of course, that woman can make charges.
Okay, just a few more from Zoom here. Matt Grubbs with New Mexico PBS. According to the criminal complaint, at least one undercover officer was present. What was the undercover officer's role? And we talked about this a little bit, but was the officer ordered not to intervene?
Question is similar to a past one about the role of plainclothes officers. And again, it's different in each situation. I think the chief spoke to that, but if you want to reiterate that.
The the whole purpose with being undercover is not to intervene and then put yourself in jeopardy. So they would be more an observer, but a really good witness to the case and provide that information for court testimony or for the procedural operational plan that they have to do that maybe save some people.
Question here from Patrick Hayes at KOB. Did police receive any 911 calls about the protesters or militia? He's also wondering if Baca had any kind of violent history to APD's knowledge.
Questions about 911 calls, what we received. I do know our deputy chief is looking into that call log at this time. It's pretty common for us during any protest to receive lots of 911 calls, so I wouldn't be surprised if we had a lot this time. The specifics of those, I think, are going to come out as part of the investigation. Chief can speak more to this if you want, but the second part of the question was
if Baca had any kind of violent history to APD's knowledge.
I think that that one is, I think folks, from what I understand in the reports I'm seeing, there certainly he was a figure in the community with some track record, but the specifics of that are probably, again, best for the DA's office.
Right. Anytime there's an investigation, we'll do a criminal background, the rap sheet, so to speak, and I imagine that's being done right now. And I have not seen it, so it's part of our protocol, so it will be available. It's probably public knowledge. If somebody would run them through NM courts or whatever, they'd find that as well.
Last question we'll take from Zoom right now, and then we'll move to you guys. A question here from Matthew Risen at the Albuquerque Journal. Why did APD say the situation ended peacefully when there was tear gas and other non-lethal munitions used on the crowd?
Question is, I think, about why, how we characterize the ending of the protest, and I don't know if Gilbert wants to even take that one, but yeah, sure.
So the reason we described it as ending peacefully is because from that point forward, from the shooting and the investigation, our emergency response teams were still on scene, and there was concern that the violence could escalate. But fortunately, the folks who were still there disbanded peacefully, and there was no more violence at that time. So that's all we were referring to.
Okay, we'll switch to in-person if you guys have questions.
Mayor, a follow-up on the firearms and magazines that were collected. We did see video of some of the members of the New Mexico Civil Guard in zip ties on the floor. Can you tell us who exactly those firearms were taken from? Were they all members of that Civil Guard, or were they also other people? And following up from that, how many people do you think were there carrying firearms?
Questions about the firearms found, and I mentioned there were dozens. I believe our commander mentioned 22. So I'll hand it over to the commander to speak to what details he is able to share at this time. I think it's pretty obvious from looking where a lot of those firearms came from, but we also want to respect the actual investigation process. Commander?
Yes, I don't have the exact number of individuals, but I know there was at least 5 that we arrested. There were at least 34 magazines and over a dozen guns. As far as who owned what at this point, that is still under investigation, so I wouldn't be able to answer that question.
And the status on the people who were involved, you said it was at least 5 people arrested. Have they been released now? Are they charged with anything? What's their status?
That I do not have the answer for. I don't know if the chief may have the answer for that.
That's okay.
We have time for just a few more questions.
Sure, and we can't speak to that. That's a question for the DA, right? So the DA is the one who would make those charges.
Obviously, we've seen the Oñate statue up in Rio Viva removed on Monday as well. People have been calling about this, and this has been an idea that has floated since at least last week. Do you think the city should have moved earlier to remove that statue?
That's a question about sort of timing and removal of the statue. Our director from Cultural Services can really field that one. I will mention that there are laws, and we in Albuquerque have a much different set of rules around public art than we do than the one up north. And so that's the primary difference. And as a reminder, the mayor doesn't unilaterally have the power to do different things with public art. Obviously, when it's a public safety issue, it's a very different category. And unfortunately, this changed categories last night. Shell, you want to add more to that?
So the question of Oñate as a figure in history is long debated and very vigorous in New Mexico. But this particular statue, we have been through these conversations and a lot of public discourse for many years. This statue is part of the public art collection. And when there were calls to pull it down last week, we did, of course, talk about it and talk about what was in the best interest and what our options were. And because it's part of the public art collection, we can't just summarily take it down or move it. What changed was public safety, but also what changed was the artist stepping forward and understanding that the level of discourse was maybe elevating, and the level of concern and kind of calls for violence against his art really meant that he could step forward with us. So that's why, otherwise we would have had to give him a 90 days notice and go through the arts board, but we were able to do that in this way. The other thing in Alcalde, that was not part of their public art collection. That was a monument. It was a direct purchase, I believe, by the county or that town, and so they could manage it differently.
Reports on social media were circulating from scanner chatter that said an APD team had referred to the militia, the New Mexico Civil Guards, as armed friendlies. Can APD respond to that? And did that have anything to do with a strategy or a protocol?
Yeah, the question about some of the terms that have been across the radio, and I think I would probably ask Gilbert to speak to that one. I know that term has been around a long time, and I know we do have it under review.
So my understanding is that the term was used by an officer about 15 days ago. So this wasn't last night, it was during a previous incident. And as the mayor said, we are reviewing it to see what the context was for that. But I think it had to do with this group informing or they were there to protect a specific property on that night.
Can you repeat that term again, Gilbert?
Emily, I think armed friendlies is how they refer to it.
We have time for one more question.
Today, before we arrived here, we did still see a lot of groups out there near the statue. A lot of people still gathering there, some even standing in the street. Do we plan to have any police presence or security presence in the area? And to follow up from earlier, also for Commander, about the rubber bullets, were they fired? Because we did hear that, and someone says they were.
Question is a follow-up on what was fired. Commander can speak to that. And just in terms of this evening, I think everyone in Albuquerque wants us to be safe. And so I would just say, I hope that folks, I know even in Alcalde, it was quite a spectacle when the statue was taken down, but it's down now. There's nothing going on there. And so, Commander, go ahead.
Yes, and we did deploy, and I apologize if I didn't mention that earlier, but we did deploy what we call a sting ball. And those are real small rubber bullets, which is used to disperse crowds or move crowds back, and we use them in crowd control.
Do you have any other reports of any injuries from either the smoke or those little rubber pellets?
I haven't received any information on that. Like I said, I know there's a lot of information that's still coming in, but I haven't received any information whether there were any injuries or not.
Okay, we'll go to Elise for one more question.
We've been talking about the state police investigation. What fraction of the incident are they investigating, and why?
Okay, we'll get to you. I did want to ask our COO, Lawrence Rail, also just to mention general Old Town security and things of that nature, which of course we're concerned about. And so our COO, Lawrence Rail, will speak to that, and then we'll get to your question.
So the area around Old Town has always been one of the jewels for the city of Albuquerque. Most of the property around the Old Town area that is owned by the city, we know it's a very active area, especially for tourism, and quite frankly for gathering for our community. On the whole, we always have security at the museums and at the public facilities. In this particular situation, as we move forward to this week, we will in turn increase our security presence there with our Department of Municipal Development Security, just to ensure that folks that might be walking, because there's a nice park there, et cetera, that folks might, and that are maybe going to Old Town area, feel a little more comfortable. So we'll have some presence there. But on the whole, as the mayor said, the statue has been removed. And we believe that, at least for now, we need to start beginning to engage in this process of having conversation about the future of this statue and how we move forward to heal this community.
So to answer your question, we think it's in the best interest in terms of fairness and transparency and make sure it's unbiased, that it be done by an independent APD's in the middle of this, and we just don't want any controversy. We want to make sure it's done right.
So are they investigating this Cuban vodka shooting, or are they investigating the police response?
Well, the police response is, as the mayor mentioned, will fall under more of an administrative, as far as the criminal charges with Baca, and anything related to any other criminal charges related to not just the shooting, but the prior incident with him. They'll take over that whole investigation. Okay.
I'm sure at the next Police Oversight Board, too, that response piece will come up, and we're very supportive of them looking into it. Okay, I think that's all for now, and I hope everyone is safe this evening. Thank you.